Alright everybody, let's talk about Confederate. So, anybody who's been following the news lately, every Sunday during Game of Thrones, there's been an ongoing protest on Twitter with the hashtag #NoConfederate. And you might not know what it means. It goes back a few months when Game of Thrones creators D.B. Weiss and Daniel Benioff were talking about what they're going to do after Game of Thrones ends. The show is in its 7th season and is planned to only go to 8. And what they pitched, what the next show is going to be on HBO with these two creators, is a show that they're calling Confederate. Now, Confederate is a drama. It's going to take place in an alternate reality or an alternate history of the present. And in this version of reality, there has been a difference in the outcome of the Civil War. Basically, the Confederacy has won the Civil War, gained its independence. According to the pitch of the show, it's now on the eve of the Third Civil War, and slavery somehow still exists. The reaction to Confederate was swift. The creator of the hashtag OscarsSoWhite led a social media campaign, and every Sunday during the airing of Game of Thrones, people post their opposition to the creation of the show Confederate. What they argue is that Confederate is more or less showing a reality that is current to today, but painting it up with slavery to try and make the black experience today not look so bad. One popular headline that came out of the whole discussion is, "I don't want slavery fanfiction." They don't trust that the creators of a show like Game of Thrones can speak to discussions on black experience today, nor are they too excited about yet another alternate history piece of fiction where the Confederates win the Civil War. There's a long and very problematic history with the Confederacy and romanticizing the Confederacy either through alternate history fiction or through revisionist history, something like Gone with the Wind. Given the portrayal of the Confederates in America, or in American media history, they're not too optimistic that there's not going to be a depiction of the Confederates that's not a little too empathetic to their cause. Which, by the way, was slavery. It was not small government or independence. They didn't care about any of that stuff. It was about keeping slavery. One way you could define it is tone deaf. However, HBO and the creators of Game of Thrones are very, very convinced that once you actually see the show when it comes out, that you'll know that they're going with a completely different route. This is not Gone with the Wind. This is not Birth of a Nation. This is not going to romanticize the Confederates at all. So what should we think about it? What do I think about it? And I'm rather conflicted, so I'll talk through a lot of my thinking. The first thing I want to talk about is Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is probably one of the largest and most impactful media events of the early 21st century. Every episode is a media event in and of itself. If you look on Twitter, literally thousands of people are watching the show and tweeting about it live. Cultural references to the show are commonplace, and now just taken for granted. You don't have to explain to many people what a Khaleesi is. And people are actually naming their children after characters in the show. Media scholars are going to be talking about Game of Thrones for decades, and it's one of the shining examples of what we're calling today the Renaissance or the Golden Age of television. However, I can see why some people would be nervous about the creators of Game of Thrones specifically taking on a show like Confederate or talking even about race in America. Where Game of Thrones is problematic comes up a lot in a few previous seasons. If you remember, Game of Thrones has gotten in trouble several times in the show's history, specifically on the discussion of gender and extra especially on the coverage of rape. There are a couple scenes in Game of Thrones, I believe season 4 and season 5, in which there are depictions of rape that many people would argue are not being given the gravity that something like rape deserves. And this is a criticism I hold of Game of Thrones. I know that there was one website that actually decided to stop covering Game of Thrones entirely because of their depiction of rape. And America has always had a very tense discussion going on about race, especially between white people and black people. However, the show is really imaginative, the writers are really strong, and Game of Thrones deserves the giant pile of Emmys it's sitting upon. The show's also being written by Nichelle Tramble-Spellman and Malcolm Spellman, two black writers. They say the show's not going to feature whips and plantations. And I think that there's a lot of promise that if these writers are on board, they might be able to help with making sure the show has at least some form of authenticity. I would be really interested to see if the show actually portrays black slavery as not that different from the kind of deplorable conditions that black people experience in America today. This also comes up because the role of the Confederacy in American history is volatile. Just a few years ago, a lot of Confederate flags were taken down, and not a lot of people think about the history of America's relationship with the Confederacy as part of American history. Not only the actual Confederacy, but symbols of the Confederacy throughout American culture. A lot of those Confederate flags that were taken down in the wake of the shooting in Charleston were not up there since the Confederacy. Symbols of the CSA, the Stars and Bars flag specifically, is a backlash against not Yankee rule, but the civil rights movement. And I do think that the troubled relationship between America and a lot of the problematic values that the Confederacy existed upon. I think in the turbulent times we live in, a show that tries to tackle these issues through America's relationship with the Confederacy could be good, but it would need to be done extremely well. Confederate already has a lot of ill will towards it, and so one slip up and this show can be in very bad water very quickly. However, I'm going to try to see a bright side. Speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, and alternate history to a degree allow us to explore the issues of today, but by taking it outside of its current context and seeing it in a new way, we can explore the issue and get it out to audiences that might not have that kind of perspective. Confederate could be a very powerful show, if written correctly, about just how bad race relations are in America today, seen through the lens of how similar it might be to a slave state existing in the 21st century. And it's not speaking alone. There have been a lot of alternate histories written about the Confederacy theoretically winning the Civil War. Most of them don't make any sense because the Confederacy was so outgunned and so outmanned and so out-resourced that there was really no chance of the Confederacy ever actually winning. However, a lot of this fiction is usually done by conservative fantasies. They completely misinterpret what the Confederacy was about, try to downplay slavery, and try to write the Confederacy as this imagined country where all of their conservative fantasies come true. There would actually be a pretty good story if the Confederacy did exist and all of the American conservative fantasies came true, and it was a freaking nightmare. Actually, that might just be called America Today. There's also going to be a competing show made by Amazon, and I'm pretty excited for this one too. It's going to explore race relations in America, but probably through a different lens. The show's going to be called Black America, and it takes place in an alternate history where black people separated the South into its own country for and by black people. I actually think that it could be a really good show, and it looks like all the people they have on board are really talented. And I actually wish that show the best. I think that it'll do really well. So where are we now? Where do I come down on this? And I'm still very conflicted. I see Confederate as having a lot of potential if done well. The problem is I'm not optimistic that these guys are going to do it well. Game of Thrones had a lot of trouble with tone deafness, especially when it came to covering issues of rape. It's basically just by the power of the brand of the show that it really survived that criticism. I feel like Confederate is going to play with bigger and more volatile issues in American politics today, and I don't think that it's going to live up to the task, especially because of HBO's penchant for, let's say, extremes. Early on in Game of Thrones, I used to call the show Swords and Boobs, and it still lives up to the name. And there's enough shows that exploit injustice against black people to make millions and millions of dollars. However, if the show gets off to a really good start, we might see in a few years a pretty revolutionary show that talks about race in America in a way that we haven't talked about in a very long time. And that would be pretty cool. However, as I said, I'm not optimistic. Until next week, I'm Tristan, a historian, IRL. Please like, share, and subscribe.